Well, it's back. This is in fact the Mustang that we used in the series with Gears and Gasoline, where we stupidly took it off-road, then had a really great performance in the autocross, fared better than we should have in the drag race, especially with such a terrible driver behind the wheel. Now, we did a ton of work on this car leading up to those events, but there was something that we didn't fix and probably should have, and that would be the release bearing, which sounds like this. Before I put it up for sale, I wanted to make sure it's right for the new owner, so in this video we're going to be replacing the flywheel, clutch, pressure plate, and of course the release bearing. And just like the series with Gears and Gasoline, big thanks to Advanced Auto Parts for sponsoring this video. Now, I did remove the nitrous system from the car, so I'm installing a clutch that's pretty similar to stock. Now, early in the video but late in the process PSA, always make sure you check your parts the earliest possible time you can. Like a dingus, somehow I managed to order the wrong rear main seal, clutch fork, and flywheel bolts. Now, this means that some of the parts might look a little different from the demonstration to the ones we actually install on the car. But even with that being the case, the process is going to be exactly the same. Our first task on this car is going to be removing the shifter. We'll start by twisting the knob all the way off and removing it, then removing the boot and bezel for the shifter. In the case of this car, we have the 12-volt outlet and the traction control button that we need to make sure is unplugged. We have to unbolt the rubber boot and remove it. This car does have a short shifter on it, which means all this has been apart before, and probably why the rubber boot is torn. Depending on what kind of car you're doing a clutch on, you may not need to do any of this. The reason we're having to do it is because our shifter is mounted right on top of the transmission. In a lot of transverse engine and transmission setups, you might not need to mess with the shifter at all. Next, I'll remove the 4 bolts that hold the shift selector on, and this bottom right one was pretty unhappy coming out. Next, we need to take our shift tower off. Now, you might have to pry on this a little bit to get it out. This should just lift right out. You can see there was a bunch of sealant on it. Okay, now we gotta go work down in the underneathy part. Before going all the way up, I'm going to disconnect the ground on the battery. Since we're gonna have to undo the starter, I'd rather be safe than sorry. Next up, I'm gonna drain the transmission fluid. We'll clean our little drain plug out here. This looks like a 3/8 square. Also, what's cool is it says drain right there. So you know that's the drain. Before you go taking this drain plug out, you need to make sure that you can get the fill plug out. You don't want to leave yourself with the drain plug out and not able to get the fill plug out. I got my drain pan under. We'll just pop this loose. Ooh, yeah. Here we go. Ugh, it's kind of yuck. Okay, I don't need every single ounce of it drained out, so we'll go ahead and put our drain plug back in. Now, even though I'm like 97% sure I can get this transmission out without taking the exhaust off, I don't want to get myself in a bad situation with the transmission hanging. Next, we're going to work on getting our O2 sensors unplugged. We got 2 at the back and 2 at the front. Next, we'll unbolt the exhaust at the back. Now we can undo the bolts up front. The passenger side is a little trickier to see. With all that undone, let's get our exhaust off. I got the pipes that I'm leaving behind bungeed up so that they don't come crashing down. Because who knows with this thing. Oh yeah. Oh, look it, wouldn't be some kind of part if it didn't have some of that orange exhaust RTV that never seals anything ever. Next, we're gonna take the drive shaft out. Starting at the back side, I'm gonna take these 4 bolts out. Now, before you take these 4 bolts out, you wanna make sure you mark the pinion flange and the drive shaft so that when you put it back together, you can orient them properly. Also, remember these are 12-point bolts, so you need a 12-point socket so you don't tear up your fasteners. Then we can go ahead and take the drive shaft off at the back flange. Now on the front side, you want to get a drip tray below because you're likely going to get some fluid coming out. And this just slides right out of the transmission. Also, there'll be fluid in this part of the drive shaft. Oh, Paul, I'm dripping. Paul, I'm dripping. I'm double dripping.
Oh no!
Oh God.
Oh no!
Now, if you want to help make less mess when we pull the transmission out, take a plastic bag and a rubber band and put it over the tail of the transmission. They also make caps for this part right here, but I don't have that. Next, we have a couple of electrical connectors we need to disconnect. One here at the back, and then one kind of in the middle. Then we'll go ahead and get the rest of the wire loom off. Oh, don't break more, don't break more. This is broken. Like that. Then I think we can just kind of pull this whole harness out like that. Next, I'm going to undo the clutch cable. This is a place where really, as I kind of like think through the whole job, probably would have made sense to put a new clutch cable in too, but I didn't get one, so we're not doing it. Next, we're going to take the starter off. Now, this starter's held on with 3 bolts that bolt from the front to the back. 2 of them look pretty easy to get to. That top third one might be a little tricky. You can see the holes in the transmission where the bolts are, at least for the bottom 2 anyway. We'll get the middle one next. Okay, well, cool. Even though it looked like it had 3 bolts holding this starter in, there was just 2. But either way, our starter is now out of the way. I'll zip tie it up there so it doesn't go flying off of there. And whoever had the trans out just left one out because, well, that was the hard one to get to. So they're just like, meh, 2 is good. Next, I'm going to focus on taking the bell housing bolts out. These are the bolts that hold the transmission to the engine. Now, depending on the setup will depend on my strategy for doing this. Typically, I like to do the hardest ones first and then work my way to the easiest ones. I am going to overcome my own potential future stupidity and make a template. This circle that I'm drawing on this bit of cardboard represents the bell housing. And then as I take a bolt out, I'm going to punch it through around so that when I go back together with it, I know exactly what bolts go where. It may not matter for this one, like they might be all the same, but they might not. I don't really know. So I'm going to punch them through. Then I don't have to ever worry about whether they're going to go through a coolant jacket when I slam them back in. Not going to stop for every one of these, but just as an example, our starter was right here. Boom. Just like that. If you are struggling to access the like very top ones, sometimes you can get to them from the top side of the car. Other times, if you lower the transmission down a little bit, that makes it a lot easier. Reach. Oh, I need to be like 1 inch taller. There we go. There we go. I won't show you guys what I had to do that. It's not okay to share. But I did get the bolt. Next, I'm gonna roll the trans jack up underneath our transmission and support it. Now, even though this transmission jack has chains, I actually prefer to ratchet strap it down because then I can really like scrunch it down pretty tight. Now, if I were flat rating this, I probably wouldn't be doing this, but we're just gonna not put a lot of pressure on it, just a little bit. Then we can unbolt our back bracket here. Now I can bump this down a little bit. We'll take out those 2 final transmission bolts now. The ones you leave behind, make them easy to get to so that you're not fighting your way around the transmission jack. These bolts were wildly inconsistently tight. Do a final check because there's almost always one rogue connector. Everything looks good. Let's bump our transmission down. And we should be able to kind of woggle it back. Now, sometimes you might have to do a little pry to wiggle it loose. Before you start prying, make sure you got all your bolts out though. Otherwise, you're gonna have a bad day trying to take a transmission out that's still bolted up. Yay, see it split apart right here. That's what we wanted. We can go right down to reveal our transmission's out. Also, it does appear this is a junkyard transmission. How about that? So the way this works is the cable attaches right down here. When you push the clutch pedal in, it moves this whole piece, and then this pushes on the clutch, engaging and disengaging it. Typically, with as bad as that release bearing noise was, this should be making all kinds of racket. And it's not. It's also like kind of intact. I was really expecting this to just be out in pieces. What I did notice is that this piece right here, this is kind of the pivot piece, it didn't seem that this was fully engaged on the pivot piece, and that may be part of our problem.
When we look at the release bearing, the one that came out of the car has a lot of free spin. It also seems like it's a bit wobbly when I spin it. Compare that to the new one, which has a pretty significant amount of drag on it when I spin. The reason the new one has drag is because there's still grease inside the bearing. And of course, that's what we want. Now, it's a little hard to see these kind of things. So if you're ever doing a job like this, make sure you spin them both back to back so that you can feel the difference for yourself.
While we're here, I'm gonna go ahead and take this pivot ball off. Once I get it off, I'll compare it to the new one because it actually looks like this is worn with kind of a weird pattern. So as you can see, the top of the ball on the one that came out of the car is kind of chewed up. So clearly, to me anyway, we had a handful of things going on that caused our problems. We'll go ahead and install our new pivot. And while I'm here, I'm gonna clean the sleeve that the release bearing rides on. Now, I did go ahead and get a new clutch fork, so we're going to install that. You can see there's a little bit of wear here and here, and here and here. These are the contact points. So I think what it was I think this was actually sitting like that rather than this basically being installed properly. Old one, here is our new one. We're gonna put a little grease basically in those spots that I showed wear on the other one. We're gonna go ahead and grease that up. Not a ton. There is a flat part on the bearing right there, which points to where the cable goes in. So we're going to go on top of the springs, not like that. Slide our bearing in, rotate so that flat spot is facing down here where our cable goes. And then we're gonna kind of center it up on there. I'll also grease inside of here, help our ball go in a little bit. Before we put that clutch fork in, I'll go ahead and grease up this sleeve right here. I'll lube the part that goes into the pilot bearing before we put that transmission in. Also go ahead and lube our pivot. Now, this is the part where we got to make sure we get it right. So we go out the window, put the bearing in, and then slide it down, slip that in. So that is how it should be, which is definitely not how it was. Well, here's our clutch, nice and exposed. This is the pressure plate. The clutch lives between the pressure plate and the flywheel, which is back here. Now for this, I don't mind using an impact, but I don't like using air tools, especially if your clutch was exploded. I don't like blowing that clutch dust all over the place. You need to hold the flywheel. There's many ways to do it. I like this bent valve way. You just drop it in a bolt hole and it holds that from going anywhere. Normally I like to find a bolt hole that is not threaded. These are all threaded, so I just put a little bit of heat shrink around it so that we don't doink up our threads. I also generally drop the clutch alignment tool in. That way the clutch disc doesn't come falling out when you take the pressure plate off, because the pressure plate can be pretty heavy. If you're taking the pressure plate off and planning on reusing it, loosen these bolts in stages, otherwise that could tweak the pressure plate. And it can be a bit heavy. This is why I put the alignment tool in there so that doesn't come falling down too. Take this off. I take this and I set it down the same way it is in the car so it goes back together the right way in case it's not labeled. And here we have our flywheel, which, look at all that cracking in it. The guy said that like a year and a half ago it had a clutch. I'm guessing based on these marks right here, they did a DIY resurfacing at the shop. Next up, I'm gonna remove the pilot bearing. This is where the input shaft of the transmission goes and rests. Now, not all cars have this, so this may not be something you need to do, but if you have one, it's worth going ahead and doing while you're here.
Now, when it comes to removing the pilot bearing, there are infinite ways that you can do it. Everything from cramming some bread in and pounding it out, to swinging over to Advance and renting a tool like this. Now, because I use doing jobs like this as an excuse to buy new tools, I tend to lean on that side a little bit more. The tool I'm using is actually meant for inner bearing races. Basically, the tool needs to go back behind the bearing and have a way to pull it out. So the pressure applied where the flywheel is to these two arms, as I rotate the bolt, will pull the bearing out. Now, I don't know if this is normal or not for this particular one, but mine actually had to come out in two separate pieces, which really is not that big of a deal at all. It's also pretty grimy here in the end of the crankshaft, which we will clean later.
Now that I have that pilot bearing out, it looks like someone has like chiseled on this end piece here, likely trying to get a pilot bearing in or out. That definitely looks like some prior workmanship sadness. I want to say something else, but I'll keep it PG-13. You can fill in your own no-no words there. Now, before putting anything new in, I'm gonna just clean that out. It's so crusty in there. Next, let's go ahead and take our flywheel off. We got our little flywheel holder right here. I actually saw something really cool. I saw someone bolt a wrench like in the flywheel and then bolt it to the engine block, and that held it in place with just the wrench. So that's another option. I'm gonna loosen these flywheel bolts by hand. That's what I like to do, especially if you're reusing the flywheel. You don't wanna warp it. Also had to go to my other toolbox to find an 11/16 socket. Not a fan of that very much. There we go. Go ahead and run the bolts out the rest of the way.
Now, before you take that last flywheel bolt all the way out, make sure you hold the flywheel so that it doesn't come crashing down.
Then you may have to rock this off of here or even tap it. If you find yourself having to tap more than maybe once, run a bolt back in and do your tapping. Also, don't tap on it like I just did if you're going to be reusing the flywheel. If you're doing like a rear main seal or something. Oh, that's heavy. I could take this off for now. Well, with the clutch and everything off, it looks like I'm going to be replacing the rear main seal, even though I really don't want to. So we'll clean it up first. This is mostly just so that none of this stuff falls in the engine when we're taking it off. I'll clean the cover real good once we get it off the car. Stupid oil leak. We got 2 bolts coming up from the oil pan. Now you might actually be able to do this seal without taking this cover off, but I think it's gonna be easier to just take the cover off and reseal the whole thing. Plus we don't know, like it may also be leaking around the side here too. You can see there's a ton of oil right there. You're this far, might as well do it all. There's a good pry spot right at the top, but you wanna kind of work your way around the cover. You may have to work a little bit, but eventually, should come off somewhat easy. There's actually what I think is like a seal retainer that I didn't get a new one of. So we're gonna have to put this back on. I'm gonna just set it to the side for now. Now, before we do anything with our seal, you wanna pay attention to where the seal is set in the recess in our rear cover. So from back to front, you can see, I don't know, maybe half a centimeter. But when we flip it over to the inside, it's basically flush with the back edge. So we want to make sure it goes back just like that. In addition to cleaning, we need to get rid of all this old RTV that's in here. This is an old trim tool that I have because this one has a channel. If you leave a big old glob like that, odds are you're not going to get a good seal on it and your cover is going to leak. And then you're going to have to do this whole job again. And you're going to be like, well, this wasn't fun the first time, but it really sucks the second time. Once you get the majority of it off, you can grab some Scotch-Brite and just finish cleaning the rest. Now that we're pretty much clean, I'll do another final wipe down before we go back together. I'm gonna set this on a couple blocks of wood. We need to drive our seal out. I'm actually gonna flip it the other way and drive it out that way. This should come out pretty easy. Just be careful when you're driving this out. You don't doink up the inner portion here. We need to clean all this out. Little brake clean in Scotch-Brite. This way we don't drag a piece of dirt or something like that while we're driving our new seal in. We'll take our seal, set it there. Key is making sure it's even when you start. A block of wood big enough to cover the seal, and then we can just tap it home. Remember, the lip of our seal should be flush with our housing. The same thing that we did to our cover, we need to do to our engine block. I'm gonna shove some paper towels at the bottom here to make sure none of this debris falls down in the oil pan, which would be really bad news. Luckily here, this is a big old steel block, so we can use a little bit more aggressive scraping, get rid of all this old sealant, take some Scotch-Brite, clean off our mating surface. I'm also gonna do all that same stuff to the crankshaft as well to make sure that our new seal has a good surface to seal against. Okay, once everybody's clean, you don't want to do this till you're basically ready to put this cover on. It's time to get our RTV all dialed in. This is just black RTV. It's kind of what I use for everything these days. I also always save my old tips. That way you can have some small tips, some big tips. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna go around this cover in the channel, since that's kind of how it was before. No need to overdo it. It looked like there was a little RTV down in the bottom edge, usually like in the corners, like that. Also keep in mind, more RTV does not equal better sealing.
For this application of installing a rear main seal, there's a handful of things that we really need to pay attention to. Not only do we have to get the seal around the crankshaft properly, we also need to make sure that our sealing flange is properly installed. And in this application, it might actually be easier to apply the RTV to the block rather than the flange flange like I did. You'll really need to use your best judgment on your specific application. If we don't install the rear main seal properly, we can end up rolling or pinching the inner part of the seal and causing a leak. There's a variety of different special tools that are made to install rear main seals. This kit here is for VWs, so you may want to look to see if there's one made for your specific vehicle. Also, sometimes the seal will have this inner plastic ring that's used to help support the seal, but can also be used to help install it. What I do when I don't have any type of seal installation tool available is I'll run my finger around the inner part of the seal. This softens it up a little bit as well as warms it up. That makes pushing the seal over the crankshaft considerably easier. You may also need to take your fingernail and just run it around the edge, forming the seal to the crankshaft. We also want to make sure that we don't mess up our RTV that we put on the flange already, because we can create another oil leak there. After getting the inner seal set properly, I'm going to install the bolts and gently press the cover into place. I don't like using the bolts to draw that flange cover in case it gets hung up. The flange may not go on straight, or worse, you might actually end up breaking a tab or part of the flange by forcing it in. Before tightening anything down, you want to make sure you follow the instructions on the RTV you use in case there's a cure time before properly torquing. When it is time to tighten down the bolts, make sure you're going in a crisscross pattern similar to how you would torque down a wheel. For this flange, the torque spec is right about 10 Newton meters.
Our final piece is this little cover right here. A lot of people replace this. I didn't get a new one, so I did not replace it. Now, if you want for this other seal, use your old rear main seal, and that'll help tap it into place. Now, before I go any further, I'm gonna clean the rusty, nasty off of these alignment dowels. This is going to help slide the transmission on a little easier. Now, before you go any further, don't do a dum-dum like I've definitely done before, and forget to put this on. You wanna put this on so you don't create future sadness for yourself. With the Flywheel, this is an area that you can actually save some money instead of buying a new one. Have your old one resurfaced. You probably don't wanna do the whiz wheel resurfacing that our old one looks like it had, but actually take it to the machine shop and have it properly resurfaced. That'll make sure the place where the clutch rides is nice and fresh. Now, with this particular Flywheel, we need to install a couple of alignment dowels, but as you can see, there's a whole bunch of holes, so here's how we're gonna find out where they go. So the way I'm going to align this is set the pressure plate down on the Flywheel and align the bolt holes that hold the pressure plate to the Flywheel. And in our case, it's going to be the inner threaded bolts. We have 3 dowels that live between the bolt holes. So what we can do is mark with a paint marker where our dowels go. Once we make our marks, we can get rid of our pressure plate, and from there, we can go ahead and install our alignment dowels. If you want to make installing these a little easier, throw them in the freezer and cool them down. This isn't a step that needs to be done on every single Flywheel. In fact, this is the first Flywheel I think I've installed that didn't already have dowels in it. I have this rarely used 12.6 millimeter deep socket that I'm gonna use, and I'm just gonna tap these in. While we're here, it's also important to take a look at your bolts that bolt to the crankshaft. On a lot of Flywheels, you'll have one bolt or a couple of bolts that are offset, meaning that the Flywheel can only go on one way. So if we take a look, we can see that right here is where our offset is on the Flywheel, and that matches this spot on the crankshaft. Next, I'm gonna get the bolts ready for the Flywheel. Sometimes when you buy new bolts, they already come with some Loctite or thread sealer on them. This can also vary application to application, so I'm gonna put some thread locker on it to make sure that we actually don't get oil leaking past the bolts. Now it's time to get our Flywheel on. Before you put your Flywheel on, make sure you don't have a shield like this that needs to go on. Also, the hole where our pilot bearing was, remember it looked like somebody had taken a chisel to try and get the pilot bearing out? I sanded that down a little bit so that we could have an easier time installing our pilot bearing. We have a mark on our crankshaft right here, and we're gonna line that up with our mark on our Flywheel, lift the Flywheel into place, and I'm gonna start one of the old bolts because it doesn't have any thread locker on it. Then what I can do is I can kind of rock the Flywheel into place. Sometimes it slips right over the crankshaft, sometimes you need to work it a little bit. We did work the old one coming off. Not surprised that we got to work this one on. You do want to make sure though you're doing this evenly and not getting your Flywheel all cocked to the side. If it's giving you a hard time, grab one of the other old bolts. So you have 2 bolts holding it in, and just take a dead blow and tap it into place. Usually you'll hear a distinct clunk when it seats. Next, we can install hand tight our thread locked bolts. Then I'm going to evenly run these in, going in a crisscross pattern. You don't want to start sending flywheel bolts home. You might end up tweaking the flywheel. Then we'll put our flywheel holding tool into place. It's going to be going the opposite way that it went when we removed the flywheel. Next up, we are going to torque this flywheel down to about 60 pound-feet of torque. Typically, when I do a flywheel and I tighten it down in stages and split the torque. So for this case, I'm gonna do 35 pound-feet and then torque it down to 60. And I'm gonna be using the crisscross pattern, so think of it just like torquing down a wheel. After I go around in the crisscross, I usually go around one more time in a circle, just to make sure I got everybody. Then if you're the type to mark bolts after you torque them, now is the time to do that. Next, we're gonna install our new pilot bearing. I'm gonna clean this orifice where our pilot bearing rides. Remember, I filed down where it looked like somebody Neanderthaled the bearing out. Here's our new bearing. Here's our improvised press tool. You wanna make sure that if you're gonna pound that bearing in with a socket or something, that you're pushing on this outer portion right here, not the inner portion. If you hammer on that inner portion, you're just gonna punch it right through and ruin your bearing. For example, this is a 27mm socket. Just like with those dowels, if you throw this bearing in the freezer, it's probably gonna help it go in a little bit easier. And you do wanna make sure this goes in nice and straight. So carefully tap that bearing in until it fully seats. You'll probably hear a change in tone when you hit it once it bottoms out. Moving right along, we need to clean our flywheel. Oftentimes these are coated with an anti-rusting agent, basically an oil. We need to get all that off there. It needs to be not only clean, but dry. A little brake parts cleaner works just fine here. And even though this is a brand new flywheel, wait till you see how dirty this is. Look how dirty that is. Any of that grease and oil that gets on the friction disc, which is the part we're gonna put on next, can actually cause premature wear. So we don't want that. Of course, we want nothing to be premature on this Mustang. Now it's time to grab our clutch alignment tool and our friction disc. You wanna make sure you're not touching that friction material. I'm holding it with my thumb through the hole and on the ends. Also, super important step. You wanna make sure you install the friction disc facing the right direction. Sometimes friction discs are labeled. Sometimes they're not. This one has no labeling on it whatsoever, but luckily, one, we paid attention when we were taking it apart, and two, our old one is labeled. We'll take our clutch alignment tool and our clutch, and we'll just go ahead and slip the alignment tool right into the pilot bearing. Just like we did with the flywheel, we need to clean the pressure plate. You can see the oil on this one, it's pretty dirty, so make sure you do a really thorough job cleaning both flywheel and pressure plate. We're gonna get our pressure plate lined up and lift it up into place. Once you have it set on the dowels, get a couple bolts started so it doesn't fall off. Also, leave your clutch alignment tool installed. We're gonna leave that installed the entire time. I'm gonna only run these in until you get a little bit of resistance. I'm not even really trying to hand tighten these just yet. Guess that's exactly what I'm doing, is hand tightening them. This is just to basically take the slack out of the bolts. The tightening procedure for most all pressure plates is going to be to crisscross, just like we did with everything else, tightening just a little bit at a time, like one turn at a time. If you tighten one bolt all the way down and then tighten another bolt all the way down, you risk damaging the pressure plate or the friction disc. This ends up being under spring tension, so you want to evenly seat that spring tension. So we're going to go to each bolt, tighten it about one turn, go across to the other side, tighten it one turn, so on until everybody's snugged up. You'll feel the bolts bottom out when they're tight. Once that happens, we're gonna then torque them. I'm gonna do it exactly like I did the flywheel. The full torque is not that much, 12 to 24 pound-feet. So I'm gonna do 10 and then probably 18. Now I know that seems kind of like a ridiculous amount of things to do, simply just to tighten down one part. However, doing a clutch can be a pretty big job, and it's worth taking a few extra minutes to make sure you do it right, rather than blowing your clutch apart right away or getting a significantly reduced life on it. Now that our pressure plate's torqued down, we can pop our alignment tool out and save this for another job. All right, back to our transmission. I got our new clutch fork here that I'm gonna install, which hopefully anyway, fits much better than the other one did. The process is exactly the same. Clean this off because I'm going to use the spline grease that came with our clutch kit. Now for this part, don't go crazy here. You're just going to need a little bit, like a real thin coating. We don't want to put too much on and have it leak all over our friction disc. Next up, we're going to roll our transmission into place. Then we can go up with it. Then we can just shove it into place. You may need to give it the old wiggle treatment, but ours went up pretty easily. Then what I like to do is find the easiest bolt and just get that started. What you want to make sure you don't do is use the bolt to pull the transmission into place. It's a pretty high risk of doing some damage in case you don't actually have it lined up. I also like to start all the bolts by hand before tightening a single one, in case you have like a weird tension in a spot or something like that. It just seems to make it easier. Then I'm gonna take my cardboard with my bolts in it, and we're just gonna get all these rest of these started. Other than the starter, I'm not gonna do the starter till probably the end. If you're struggling to reach the top, like the very top bell housing bolts, lower the transmission down. Sometimes these are the hardest ones because you can't see what you're doing. Before I put the engine up, I'm gonna do the starter, which I have zip tied right here. It kind of seems like it's gonna be easier to get this all in where I have a little bit more room to reach up over the top. So if you're doing the transmission, taking it out for some reason, this might be the easier way. We hit the jackpot on the way out because our top bolt was missing. I got another bolt because I want to put it back together the right way. So we're gonna do it here. Okay, there's two. And then the third one is up high. I have successfully found the hole, and you have successfully looked at my elbow. If you're like a Ford tech or have done this Mustanging a bunch of times and have like a super cool strategy for these bolts and you want to share it in the comments, that would be dope. It won't help me out right now, but it might help somebody else, and that's cool. I'm going to start by tightening the bottom one so the starter's all where it's going to be, and then I think a series of wobbles coming from the front is probably the strategy for getting the top ones.
We have a handful of things left that we need to button up, starting with getting our transmission mount properly installed. Once you have the transmission mount bolted up, take your time lowering the jack down just to make sure that you have everything properly sorted. Then we can run our wiring harness and get all of our connectors plugged back in, then reattach our clutch cable. Next, I'm gonna go ahead and reinstall the exhaust. Now, I did get a new gasket to replace that orange RTV that was on there beforehand. Also, it might be easier to install the drive shaft before the exhaust in this specific application, but you can really do it either way.
Gotta take our little baggie off here. We'll probably get a little bit of fluid coming out, so just be careful there. Put the front in first. Make sure you clean and lubricate the front of the drive shaft where it goes into the seal. Then we'll hook it on in the back. Make sure you line up the mark that you made, in our case, this pink mark, and then go ahead and tighten down these bolts. Now, one of our final steps under the car is going to be filling our transmission fluid. I got our fluid right here. I love these little pumpy bottle things. It screws on the top, and then you can just feed it up there and pump till your transmission is full. Pump it full of this red goodness until the fluid starts to leak back out. That's how you set the level, which is pretty common on most cars, I think. Once that fluid starts dripping out, go ahead and put your fill plug back in, snug it down, clean up a mess you made if you made a mess. Before you bring the car all the way down or off jack stands or whatever, do one more final visual inspection. Make sure you don't leave any tools up there or anything silly like that.
Next, we're gonna move inside the car and focus on our shifter. Now, the shifter is supposed to actually have a gasket on this car. Ours didn't have one when we took it apart. So I'm gonna do kind of what we did when it came apart, and that's put a bead of RTV around this top piece of the transmission and kind of create our own gasket. Not a perfect world, I would go ahead and replace it with the proper gasket, but this way should work pretty well too. I am gonna let the RTV cure a bit longer than I would if I were, say, sealing an oil pan though. Then we can go ahead and mount our shifter down, then put the ring with the rubber boot in, then install the shift boot and trim piece, making sure to plug in that traction control button, and finally twist on our shift knob. Next, I can install the ground strap, powering back up the car. I actually remade these ground straps during the Mustang series because they were pretty awful when I got the car. The last piece of our clutch job is far and away the hardest part, following proper break-in period. Now, this may depend on the clutch manufacturer on what you really need to do. In the case of this clutch, they recommend 1200 to 1500 clutch cycles of normal street driving before even hitting wide open throttle. This will properly seat the friction disc with the pressure plate and the flywheel. Make sure you follow your clutch manufacturer's recommendation on the break-in period, as that could easily impact the warranty. Okay, there we go, a new clutch, pressure plate, flywheel, pilot bearing to get our Mustang all dialed in. And now it's time for me to get this thing ready to put up for sale, so with that, I'm out. Have an awesome day, and I'll talk to you again next time.